I'm Paul Kangas with a Nightly Business Report news brief. Upbeat earnings at Hewlett-Packard. The computing giant beat the street tonight with fiscal first quarter earnings of 37 cents a share, 3 cents above estimates. Revenues jumped almost 10% to $21.5 billion. The results come just 1 week after HP's controversial CEO, Carly Fiorina, was ousted. Wall Street was narrowly mixed, helped by upbeat remarks on the economy from Fed Chief Greenspan, but hurt by a jump in oil prices. The Dow lost 2 points. The Nasdaq fell 1.75. Standard & Poor's 500 managed to gain a fraction. Tomorrow, how one healthcare company is finding ways to save lives and money. Watch Nightly Business Report at 6:30 here on 13.
Welcome to the broadcast. Tomorrow there'll be a document released called A Compact Between the United States and Europe that addresses the principal issues that divide Europe and the United States. Philip Gordon was part of that effort, and he talks about the document this evening.
The sort of conventional wisdom that has been out there a few years now, that Americans and Europeans just see the world too differently, and we're going our separate ways, and we can't do this, it's too hard. What we did in this compact, by pulling these people together, is show that no, it's not too hard. It is hard, and there are differences, but the overall outcome is worth making specific compromises on some of these hard things.
Also this evening, James Stewart talks about his new book, a controversial book about the Walt Disney Company and its CEO, Michael Eisner.
I did initially think it would be looking at the interplay of commerce and culture and how product is created and how the Disney values are reflected in the product. You know, remnants of that book are in there, the making of Pirates of the Caribbean, the rise of reality TV, and Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. But in the middle of all this, while I had a ringside seat, Roy Disney abruptly resigned from the board. Stanley Gold followed him, and the company was suddenly at civil war with a national shareholder movement to try to throw Eisner out of his job. The story changed very dramatically.
Europe and the United States, and Disney and Michael Eisner. Next. Funding for Charlie Rose has been provided by the following.
The Coca-Cola Mexico Foundation builds school shelters where children from remote villages stay during the week, cutting their commute to school from 6 hours to 60 seconds, satisfying a thirst for education. The Coca-Cola Company.
To individuals, institutions, corporations, and governments around the world is proud to bring you this hour of Charlie Rose on PBS.
Additional funding for Charlie Rose was also provided by these funders.
And by Bloomberg, a provider of multimedia news and information services worldwide. From our studios in New York City, this is Charlie Rose.
We begin this evening with the Transatlantic Alliance. Next week, President Bush will leave for a 3-day trip to Europe. The visit will address the tensions that resulted from strategic disagreements over issues such as Iraq, Iran, the Middle East, and the environment. Joining me now from Washington is Philip Gordon. He is the director of the Center on the United States and Europe and senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. He's also the author of this book, Allies at War, America, Europe, and the Crisis over Iraq. He is one of the 55 prominent foreign policy experts from both sides of the Atlantic who signed a document being published this Thursday. It is a diplomatic agreement between the two sides that offers policy recommendations for dealing with the challenges of the Transatlantic Alliance. I am pleased to have Philip Gordon back on this program. Welcome back.
Thanks. Nice to be here.
Tell me about this compact. How did it come into being? What needs does it address? And what's in it?
Well, it's actually a rather remarkable document. It is a detailed and specific agreement, as you said, signed by 55 prominent experts on both sides of the Atlantic, almost equally distributed, which goes through all of the key challenges of the day: Iran, Iraq, China, the International Criminal Court, global warming, many others, the United Nations, the European Union. And it shows, it demonstrates that Americans and Europeans can indeed agree even on these very difficult strategic challenges that we face. In other words, the sort of conventional wisdom that has been out there a few years now, that Americans and Europeans just see the world too differently, and we're going our separate ways, and we can't do this, it's too hard. What we did in this compact, by pulling these people together, is show that, no, it's not too hard. It is hard, and there are differences. But the overall outcome is worth making specific compromises on some of these hard things.
Now, the people who come together to hammer this out, they didn't come representing any particular point of view except their own, looking for a way to get at these difficult issues.
That's right, and you'll notice there are no institutional affiliations of this. These are individuals. Most of them have played some governmental role. On the U.S. side, we have 2 former national security advisors, a former deputy secretary of state, former deputy national security advisors, some prominent columnists, a lot of other senior officials, and it's also bipartisan. We have people who have worked for Reagan, Bush 1, Clinton, and the current President Bush. And similarly on the European side, former defense ministers, prominent analysts, a range of views. And again, the point is, I don't think any of us 55 agree with every single word in this thing. But what we do agree is that the United States-European relationship is very important, and we have to somehow find a way of getting out of this vicious circle that we've been in, where each side resents the other, and therefore we're unable to work with each other on some of these key challenges, and put a more positive circle in place so that we actually start working constructively together. You asked how it came about. It might be just worth a quick word on that. And like many initiatives, it has different origins. But Tom Malinowski, with whom I worked in the Clinton administration, and I often said we thought it would be possible to do such thing. We've been talking about it for months, through last year's Iraq crisis and all the rest. And we said, you know, why don't we give this a try? Let's just see if we could start drafting it and get people to agree. And similarly, there was another one of these, there are many of these the test. And it looked among that group that there was enough agreement that we would give it a try. So that's what we did. We started to draft it. We circulated it around, took in lots of comments. And the remarkable thing was, rather than showing no way, issues are too sensitive, Iraq, Israel, the environment, it actually showed the opposite. It showed constructive people being able to say, you know what, it's worth it to start putting a more positive dynamic together.
Tell me what's wrong with transatlantic relationships today.
Well, there's lots wrong with transatlantic relationships today. We lost the feeling that we were all in this together, the notion of we're on the same side, we're facing common challenges, we have differences, but we're together. That has really seriously eroded over the past couple of years. It wasn't just Iraq, although Iraq was a major blow. But, you know, already starting with the end of the Cold War, we started to lose this notion that we were in it together. And then even more, after 9/11, the impact that had on the United States and our strategic views really gave Americans and Europeans the sense that they just saw the world too differently. And I think, you know, that was unfortunate. And it almost led to the point that the mutual perceptions were so bad. In other words, Europeans were so hostile to us and our administration and our policies, and Americans were so resentful of their lack of support on issues like Iraq, that there was this feeling that we were going our separate ways. And I think both sides are actually starting to learn that we can't let that happen. On the U.S. side, there was a view, dating back a few years, that, you know what, it didn't even matter that much. We were very powerful. We had interest in the world. The Europeans were inward-looking, and they didn't agree with us in these things. And therefore, you know, we should just go about our business. And I think personally that that's what we did a bit too much of during the Iraq crisis. Just took this view that we don't need you, we're strong, rich, powerful, and we're just going to do it, and we expect you to follow. And it turned out that they didn't follow.
Part of that came about, it seems to me, and I'm asking a question really rather than suggesting what I think, because the United States came out of Kosovo and came out of Afghanistan with some sense that its military was so far superior that it's better off just doing it itself.
No question about it, and that's almost true on the military side. You know, what happened during the 1990s is we got so powerful that we got confident enough to believe we could do all of these things. You know, the irony is that just about, you know, less than 15 years ago, Americans were debating decline. You know, we thought we were in big trouble. We had deficits and debts, and the Germans and the Japanese were going to surpass us. And then we have this decade in which we grow fantastically economically, our technology grows, our military grows, we do Bosnia, Kosovo, Afghanistan, and we really prove that we have this incredible military. By the year 2000, we're spending more than the next 10 countries put together. And all of that led to this great feeling of American power. And the Bush administration came to office thinking that the Clinton administration was far too deferential to allies. You mentioned Kosovo. The Bush view was that during Kosovo, the Clinton administration, it wrung its hands and it tried to get the allies on board and it waited too long. And their view was the way to lead is to be decisive. We're powerful, we're right, we're going to act, and the others will follow. And that was a natural consequence of the great power that America had at the beginning of this current century. And when you put on top of that the feeling of vulnerability that we had after 9/11, it just led to this view that these things are too important, we need to just go about our business. But as I say, I think we're starting to realize that there are limits to that. It's certainly right that America has to lead and be decisive in the world, but I think in Iraq, in generally, we are starting to discover, and I think this explains why the administration is pursuing this diplomatic charm offensive right now. I think we started to discover that it's not so simple, and actually, you know, Europeans, for all their flaws and inability to help, we actually do need the burden sharing and the legitimacy and so on. So I think we're starting to rethink this attitude. Now we no longer have the biggest surpluses in history, but the biggest deficits in history. And now I think when the president goes over there, it's a little bit less the attitude that we're right and we're just going to do it, and a little bit more, hey, can we get you guys to help?
And how responsive the European, we'll come to the compact's point of view about some of these issues in a moment, but how responsive do you think the Europeans will be when the president comes to Brussels on the 21st?
Well, I think they're going to be cautious. They're still skeptical, frankly, and that is indeed where the compact comes in. Because I think that the administration is going over there, as I say, sincere in its desire to reach out diplomatically and put the past behind them, but not necessarily ready to do the hard things that would really make a difference. In other words, President Bush will go over there and he'll give a great speech and he'll reach out and he'll say nice things. It's not clear, though, that he's going to be able to go over there with the policy initiatives that say, you know what, we take your concerns seriously, and that's why we want you to help us on what we take seriously. And that's where, as I say, the compact comes in, because what we did, those of us who signed that, is we took the interests of the other side seriously. And there are all sorts of trade-offs in this thing, but just to name one, we in the compact go a long way towards recognizing the challenge of global warming and the environmental challenge, and say that the United States should be ready to do something about that. And in return, for example, we expect Europeans to do more and contribute more in Iraq. See, that way I think the president could really wake the Europeans up. And because they're so skeptical, a speech isn't going to do it.
Yeah.
A set of policy initiatives, though, might get them to say, you know what, the Americans are thinking things differently here. We should respond and step up. And that's the sort of trade-offs we have in the compact, and that I think the administration needs to be thinking about.
Yeah, and now you've got other voices being added to the conversation. I think Senator Clinton was in Munich saying that perhaps NATO should be more involved in other parts of the world, especially in Africa.
Well, NATO is one of the things that Americans do expect from Europeans, and that would be part of this trade-off. There's a big debate, and I think one of the things that the administration is debating within itself is to what degree they should take the European Union seriously. And that's one of the things we have in the compact, where we think the United States should recognize that even though we want to preserve NATO and we think it's important, the European Union, on the challenges we face today, promoting democracy in the Middle East, delivering humanitarian assistance, and even some military things, the European Union, whether we like it or not, is actually in a position to deliver on a lot of those things. You know, this isn't the Cold War anymore, where we needed NATO to defend Europe against the Soviets. Now we're dealing with sanctions, trade, humanitarian assistance, homeland security, democracy promotion, and the Union, increasingly, is dealing with that stuff. So that's another element of our bargain, where the United States agrees to take the EU seriously in exchange for some things from the Europeans. And I think the President is thinking about this. You know, he's going to the EU, not just Brussels and NATO,
right,
but he's actually having dinner with his EU counterparts as well. I think they're starting to think about this part of the bargain.
And that brings us to Iran. So what happens on Iran?
Well, Iran is the hardest thing. I'll say it right up front. Iran is the hardest bargain to strike, and the issue with the greatest potential to blow all the rest of this out of the water. I do think there's a potential deal on Iran that's in our mutual benefit. It's in our mutual benefit because at present, what Americans and Europeans are doing in Iran isn't working. Americans are trying sticks and sanctions and military threats, and Europeans are trying carrots in the form of trade and diplomatic dialogue. And it's not working, and the Iranians are on course to build a nuclear weapon.
And stop there for a second.
Sure.
Why do they continue to argue otherwise? I mean, why don't they simply say, well, you know, we are preparing a way to get to that point if we decide to cross that line? But, I mean, they deny even the possibility that that's what they want to do.
Yeah, that's right. They do that for the same reason other threshold nuclear powers have done it. You know, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty has a great flaw in it, which is that it allows countries to pretend not to be building nuclear weapons, which enables them to have all of the technology for the nuclear fuel cycle, and to have uranium and to enrich it and to do reprocessing and go right up to the threshold of having a nuclear weapon. And so if the Iranians said, you know, we're actually interested in nukes, we may not cross the threshold, but we're actually interested in going through that process, the rest of the world would say, hold on a minute, we're not going to cooperate with you. You see, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty obliges us to cooperate with them on civilian nuclear energy as part of the original deal. We give you the civilian nuclear energy so that you don't build a bomb. And the flaw in the treaty is it allows them to go right, so long as they don't admit they're trying to get a bomb, it allows them to go right up to the threshold, and then they can withdraw from the treaty and have the bomb. And the problem with our mutual approach is the Europeans don't have any more carrots to offer, and we don't have any more sticks, because we already sanction Iran, we don't talk to Iran, we don't trade with Iran, so our sticks are pretty minimal, and the military option is enormously complicated. And on the European side, they don't have many more carrots to offer, because they already trade with Iran, they already talk to Iran. So the only possible deal, if you really want to change the way Iran is looking at this issue, their structure of incentives or disincentives, then we and the Europeans have to do it together. The Americans have to get into the game of carrots, and the Europeans have to get in the game of sticks. And that's what we propose in the compact, where we tell the Iranians that we do not accept them getting a nuclear weapon. We insist they abide by their Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty commitments. We insist that they abandon the nuclear fuel cycle. But if they do that, there's something in it for them, which is support from the Europeans on civil nuclear energy, better trade relations with Europeans, and an openness from the United States to address some of the other issues that we have with them. We really need to get on with this together, because what we're doing now just isn't working.
Speaking of the EU, is the United States and the European Union looking at terrorism with a different assumption as to causes and ways to engage?
Yes, and that's been one of the problems in the relationship, frankly. Both sides obviously take terrorism seriously. Europeans have a long history with terrorism. But there's definitely a difference in explanations of what is really going on and what the root causes of terrorism are. And there's also a difference in the degree to which you need to deal with it. And by that I mean Americans' tolerance for threats in general and terrorism in specific is very low. And it goes back to the point we were talking about with American power. Because Americans aren't used to being vulnerable, and Europeans are much more, they are just not prepared to sit back and try to manage this threat and say, well, terrorism is a problem, but we just sort of have to curb it a little bit. And that's what led to this sort of American war on terror. And the president said, we're dealing with this. If that means invading Iraq and spending hundreds of billions of dollars, we're going to eradicate and win this war on terror. Whereas the European attitude is, look, we've been dealing with terrorism for a long time. It has complex political motivations. You can't simply eradicate it by throwing your means at it and with military force. You do need to manage it and try to deal with those root causes. So there is a real difference in emphasis both on what is going on and on how to deal with it. But just to add, I think that we're coming around towards a similar view. It's interesting that in the President's State of the Union address...
That's what I was going to say.
Well, go ahead. I mean,
no, go ahead. I mean, he basically, the idea of democratic reform is that somehow will address basic causes of terrorism.
That's right. It's the irony of it is it's sort of the Americans coming around to the root cause argument, where the first phase was, you know, we're gonna whack the terrorists and we're going to arrest them and kill them and defend ourselves. But the speech was really a recognition that until you dry up the source of the problem, the resentment that these terrorists feel that lead them to do the sorts of things that you do. You still have to fight the war and kill and capture and arrest terrorists. But the President's speech was a recognition that you also have to deal with the causes. And the other core thing where we're coming together that's really important here is the Middle East, where until Yasser Arafat died, the Europeans were screaming at the Americans, get engaged with the Middle East, you have to deal with Palestine, which is one of the causes of terrorism, and the Americans would respond, we're not dealing with Arafat, and that problem has little to do with it, it has to do with other things. Now we can put